Hello, and welcome to this Haddin Forum presentation on the implications of the United Nations Decade of People of African Descent. What an apt topic for Black History Month, and what an important issue to address amid the polarizing politics surrounding the matters of race and ethnicity and the education of today's young people. Dr. John Maddox, an associate professor of Spanish and African American Studies in our soon-to-be named Department of World Languages and Literatures here at UAB, is a great person to give this talk because he's such an accomplished scholar in Afro-Hispanic and Afro-Lusophone studies, and because he is a key ally of often underrepresented and marginalized groups. Since receiving his PhD from Vanderbilt in comparative literatures of Spanish and Portuguese in 2014, Dr. Maddox has been a comparatist of historical fiction about enslaved African people all over this Hispanic world and Lusophone world, the Caribbean, from the Caribbean to Brazil. His interests encompass the African diaspora and its impact in a transatlantic sense from Africa to the Americas to Europe. At UAB, he is taught at all levels in Spanish from 101 to graduate students, and also has taught Portuguese and Brazilian culture. He's currently giving a capstone seminar on Brazil now to our world languages and literatures majors. Not only that, he is dedicated as a faculty advisor to numerous student activities such as Palomitas, which is Spanish and Latin American Film Club, and Sigma Delta Pi, which is our National Honor Society. And he's even added the Spanish language ambassadors to that group of accomplished students. Dr. Maddox's thought has been deeply influenced by the inter-American literature approach of his professors, Earl Fitz and William Luis Emmanuel Oliveira. In particular, Dr. Maddox has worked with Luis and Oliveira for 10 years at the prestigious Afro-Hispanic Review. In fact, in 2017, he co-edited with Graciela Maglia a special issue based on a wonderful colloquium that he co-organized here at UAB, the UAB Vanderbilt Colloquium on Black Resistance and Negotiation in Latin America. The expansive reach of this journal, which incorporates Latinx studies, Equatorial Guinea, the Spanish-speaking country in the African continent, as well as Afro-Asia, helped form his cosmopolitan view of the African diaspora. The American Association of Spanish and Portuguese, or Teachers of Spanish and Portuguese, the AATSP, has helped him remain a part of the Big Tent organization that includes everyone from kindergarten teachers to university professors and in between, even Ivy League professors. His essays have appeared in and won awards in Hispania, which is the flagship journal of Spanish and Portuguese in our profession, and the oldest journal in the United States of Spanish language topics and cultural topics. And he is currently serving his second term as college and university representative for the AATSP. He's elected by a community of his peers because that's how much they respect him for his great work. Part of what he does is lead a graduate student paper competition, which encourages young scholars to begin networking and publishing. As far as his publications are concerned, in 2021, Dr. Maddox had not one, but two books in print. One with Bucknell University Press called Challenging the Black Atlantic, which is on the contemporary novels of Afro-Colombian Manuel Zapata Oliveira, as well as Afro-Brazilian Ana Maria Gonçalves, how they depict a history of the African diaspora that is even more expansive than the famous cosmopolitan vision of Blackness that Paul Gilroy writes about. The second volume that he published in 2021 is co-authored with Thomas Stevens of Rutgers University, is a dictionary of Latin American identities. It's published with the University of Florida Press that basically includes terms on race, ethnicity, sexuality, and gender. And these are terms from the three major languages of the Americas and their creoles. He has a forthcoming book as well, Fractal Families in the New Millennium, narrative by Afro-Puerto Rican women. That's coming out in this year with the University of Wales Press. It includes interviews with the authors themselves as well as cultural critics, and it addresses issues that inform racism from the colonial period to today. Are these titles coming to a list of banned books near you? Let us hope not. To the contrary, Dr. Maddox is a generous scholar, professor, and person whose writing, teaching, and service represent the very best of education in our state, nation, and world. His body of work substantially contributes to the light shining from the beacon at UAB, illuminating others about how enriched our society is because of its diversity. Please put your questions in the chat, and please join me in welcoming Dr. John Maddox.
Thank you, Dr. Moore. Dr. Moore is a fantastic colleague and friend, and I'm very grateful for that generous introduction. I'm grateful for you all coming out to yet another Zoom activity on a Friday afternoon. Thank you again for being here. I'm going to share my screen and we'll get started. So I'm here to talk about the United Nations Decade for People of African Descent. I call it UN because the two key areas of the UN that are involved in it are the Human Rights Council and human rights discourse in general, and UNESCO are both big promoters of this event. And it's kind of framed my work serendipitously. And so I'm going to give you guys an overview of what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk a little bit about how I came to this work. I'm going to talk about the decade itself, a few precursors just to not give people the wrong impression, my work, and then I'm going to just throw out some ideas and look toward the future in my own work and in what we can do here at UAB to further what the Decade of African Descent started. As we can see from this map, most Black people are in Latin America. This comes as a shock to many of my students and sometimes to people that just don't study this area. We don't think about this every day. But if you look at this, this map, this is from Emory University, a website called Slave Voyages. You can see that in the United States, 307,000 people survived a harrowing journey that killed many, but we could document 307,000 people versus Brazil's 3 million people that came to the Americas. Brazil has more African descended people in it, has more Black people in it than any country in Africa except Nigeria. You can check Henry Louis Gates on that. You've got thousands and thousands of people enslaved throughout the Caribbean. And so this is something that has tied together my two areas of interest, the Portuguese language and the Spanish language. And it's something that's given coherence to what would otherwise be a very fragmented project. It's something that I've been interested in since I was an undergraduate. I loved the poetry of Nicolas Guillen. And I want to throw that out as well, that slavery cannot be removed from the history of Black people in the Americas. And there's a lot of pain, there's a lot of sadness, there's a lot of tragedy involved in that. But this is a group of people that have created tremendous contributions to the culture of the Americas. And when I fell in love with this topic, was as an undergraduate reading Nicolas Guillen. Now, Nicolas Guillen was a very unique poet in my experience as an undergraduate, because I was a musician at the time, and it was like music. His poetry was called poemas sones. The son is like roots music for salsa, right? And so it was cool. Keep in mind that the African diaspora has made a huge impact on the Americas. There's a tragic history to the diaspora, but it's also cool, it's also fun, it's also fascinating to learn about the human condition in a way that unites the Americas, because the diaspora unites the Americas. It's an inter-American and transatlantic phenomenon. So these paradigms we've been handed, these Eurocentric paradigms of national literatures, of studying one half Europe, one half Latin America, they just don't work when you study the African diaspora. Look at this map again. We've got 7,600 people being taken to Europe. And I have colleagues that are delving deeper into Afro-Europe and that history as well. It's also a topic that ties together things that are central to today's ideas and debates about identity. The plantation, which is something we focus on in the Caribbean, Antonio Benitez Rojo spoke about the repeating island, the different changing plantation forms throughout the Caribbean. And the plantation formed our notions of race, but also our ideas of gender, sexuality, class, and nationality. Enslaved people worked on plantations, particularly in sugar in the Hispanic Caribbean. But they also worked in mining in places like Colombia and in Brazil. But the plantation continues to inform my thought as Antonio Benitez Rojo understood it. I also feel grateful to be in a moment when the academy is at a place where it can study the African diaspora in this way. Until the 20th century, basically the academy was too racist to study the African diaspora in this manner, to seek out a Black literature and to seek out Black history and Black culture. And so for that reason, before the 1960s, I would say, the African diaspora was understudied everywhere. There were precursors, there were well-meaning scholars, but I and we are lucky to be able to study the African diaspora in a world where the academy has become much more democratic and where people want to rescue these forgotten voices from the past. Thankfully, we have support from the United Nations in doing so. You can see a precursor to the decade, that's the topic of this talk, in the Slave Route Project, and that was in 1994. UNESCO basically worked with historians and anthropologists and various governments to create monuments and to memorialize areas along the slave route where people were enslaved in Africa and taken to the Americas. You see lots of statues being erected. You see lots of historical projects focusing on African enslavement in the 1990s. Naturally, the Black experience cannot be reduced to enslavement. So it's a good thing that a different approach was adopted in later years. The UN made strides to address issues related to racism. I'm going to skip over Santiago and go straight to Durban on this slide because that's the goal of the UN Human Rights Council and the goal of UNESCO. In Durban, South Africa, 2001, they held the World Conference Against Racism, Racial Discrimination, Xenophobia, and Related Intolerances. In the literature on this, people just call it Durban 2001. The goal was to ensure Black rights are respected throughout the world. And they make declarations, the Declaration of Durban regarding the recognition of Black peoples and the and efforts to protect their human rights. On the way to Durban, the United Nations held regional conferences. And the regional conference of the Americas was held in Santiago de Chile in the year 2000. And this is very important for the Spanish-speaking world because this is where Black activists and Black rights activists, scholars, and government officials gathered to discuss what their goals were to address racism throughout the Americas. Sadly, the United States was not involved in this conference in a meaningful way. So this is a Latin American phenomenon. And because of that, the definitions that came out of it were focused on Latin America and their local issues. One word that we'll come back to in a second that came from this is the term Afrodescendiente. That's a term that did not exist. And in English, we've translated it as people of African descent. I just say Afrodescendant or Afrodescent as a concept. So in Santiago, these activists and these scholars made a declaration stating that Black rights should be, that Black people should be recognized as a group and that their rights should be protected through laws and through human rights laws and human rights discourse. From these recognitions of Black peoples throughout the Americas comes the political and philosophical framework for what became the Year of People of African Descent in 2011. The organizers of that year believed that 1 year simply was not enough to recognize the entire African diaspora. This is UNESCO's at the forefront at this point. And so we come to the UNESCO Decade of African Descent, which is 2015 to 2024. I'm a lucky guy. As I said at the beginning of this presentation, I graduated in 2014. So it lined up very neatly with my tenure track and with my scholarly project. But as you can see, that decade is quickly coming to an end, and we need to think about what comes after the decade for people of African descent, and that's what I will be concluding with today. The decade for African descent is something that has brought much needed attention to the African diaspora. It is something that has posed a lot of questions in academia and in government and in educational organizations of what are you doing for this event? And these are the people who care about that answer. So that is something that has created a structure that has brought attention to people and movements that have existed for centuries. Just to give you guys a quick background of Black writers and Black figures from Latin America, here's just a handful of people who lived and died or who were doing work well before the decade of African descent, well before the term Afrodescendant or Afrodescent was coined. We've got Juan Latino in Spain, and John Moore has a book about Jose Soler. So Black lives were being written about in Golden Age Spain. In colonial Latin America, you've got Maroons, runaway slaves that formed communities. You've got Gaspar Yanga in Mexico. There's still a town named for him and that his descendants live in, Afro-Mexicans. Palenque is the term for a village that people form when they run away from slavery. So you're gonna hear this term a lot. It's not something you use every day in most cases, but Palenque is very important. There's a town called Palenque in Colombia that also considers itself the first free people of the Americas. They're competing with Yanga there, but their date is earlier. So we've got Black people being recognized and who are standing up for their rights or their freedom in their own cultural contexts. You got Juan Francisco Manzano, which is the only slave narrative in Latin America, the only slave narrative as we understand it, because it was written partially for British abolitionists along with Cuban intellectuals. You've got Arturo Alfonso Schomburg, who was Puerto Rican. He was Afro-Puerto Rican. He lived in Harlem. He's the guy who chronicled the Harlem Renaissance. If you want to study the Harlem Renaissance at the New York Public Library, you're looking at his collection, or at least his collection was the basis of those artifacts from the African diaspora. Quince Duncan is a Jamaican Costa Rican who has been documenting the Afro-Costa Rican experience for decades. Abdias do Nascimento, who became a senator before he died, but he founded first the experimental Black theater in Brazil. He was a playwright, and he was one of the founders of, or probably the most visible founder of the United Black Movement in 1978 in Brazil. And the mentor to my one of my authors in my book is Jorge Artel. He's a poet who wrote on Black identity in Colombia decades before the decade for people of African descent. So I want to recognize and be grateful for the decade for people of African descent, while reminding our audience here and people in my scholarship that Blackness has been recognized in Latin America, and it has been a reason for people to write, and it's been a reason for people to stand up for their rights. So let's go back to this term that emerged in the year 2000. It's an affirmative Black identity based on human rights discourse. Many scholars and many people will say that it replaces colonial terms, including the term Black, which I personally find problematic. And it replaces phenotype, is the scholarly term. Most people just call it looks. How do you look? With historical and political factors. So it creates a diasporic consciousness. What does that mean? It means that a Black person in Chile, which exists, or a Black person in Argentina, who exists, knows about a Black person in Cuba or Puerto Rico, and views him or herself as part of that same group. This is something that you can use for affirmative action laws, which are very controversial in Latin America because there's so many mixed race people. Afrodescendant exists in a context where many countries will say that racism does not exist because they are a racial democracy and because people are of mixed race. And so Afrodescendant is a way to affirm Blackness with the full weight of human rights discourse, ideally with the weight of the law. In many cases, it will be something related to land rights. There are still descendants of enslaved people that formed villages, and their descendants are still living on that land. So Afrodescendant is an important development. I personally disagree with not using the term Black or Negro in Latin America. For example, in Costa Rica, they are celebrating El Día del Negro. Many times people will try to skirt the word Black, and they will think that they are somehow complimenting someone. I believe that the term Black in the United States, throughout the Americas, and even in Europe in some cases, is going to be a political term that people have used to gather around, much like the term Afrodescendants. So that's my humble disagreement with Alejandro Campos Garcia, the sociologist who wrote the introduction to Identidades Políticas en Tiempos de Afrodescendencia, which is the text that I'm basing much of this introduction on. Something that the decade has done is inspire educators and academics to hold conferences, do bound volumes, do annals, to do scholarship in order to recognize this grossly under-recognized population. Two of those that I've been lucky enough to be involved in are Afrodescendencia in Puerto Rico, Rio Piedras. I participated in the 2015 conference, which was the first of its kind, and the first international meeting of researchers in Afro-Latin American studies in Cartagena de Indias, Colombia. For those of you who are not familiar with Colombia, it's like a Havana on the coast of Colombia. It's part of its Caribbean region there. Again, going back to that idea of a repeating island, a repeating Caribbean that goes beyond a national border. Afrodescendencia brought together Quince Duncan, Mayra Santos Febres, all of the Black Puerto Rican authors that are in my my second book of criticism. The first international meeting of researchers was designed to be an homage to the 100th anniversary of the birth of Manuel Zapata Olivella. He has received much needed attention over the last decade, particularly in the United States. The United States scholars, there were people in the Afro-Hispanic Review writing about Manuel Zapata Olivella in the 1980s, but he has received a lot of attention, partially because of these UN efforts. These are just two of many conferences throughout the Americas, and I was involved in them, so I mentioned them. My work started before the Decade for People of African Descent. I, again, was looking for a way to make my Portuguese and Spanish curriculum coherent, at least coherent enough to finish a dissertation, right? You have to focus on something to finish that PhD, right? And so I wrote my, I wrote actually my first semester at Vanderbilt. I wanted to write a paper comparing these two gigantic novels. One is 1,000 pages long, the other is about 700 pages long. And I was talking to Emanuele Oliveira, and she says, "John, you can't finish this in a semester." And I'm like, well, yes, I can. Yes, I can. You cannot finish this in one semester. So my logic was, well, if I can't finish in a semester, let's see if I can finish it in a degree program. And that formed the basis of my dissertation called Dramas of Memory. And I mention it not because I think that you guys are going to go out and read it, but because it's kind of the groundwork. I know that some graduate students are going to see this. It's going to be the groundwork for my book and several of my publications that came afterwards. So since Latin America officially only has one slave narrative, as we understand slave narratives in the United States, my argument was that contemporary historical novels about slavery go back to the origins of literature itself. Why? Because they are recreating that transition from the oral world of enslaved people to the written world of literature today. That has parallels with the history of literature itself in the West. And so that's why I view these novels about slavery as tragedies, much like Greek tragedy in both form and content. Many people will call Manuel Zapata Oliveira's novel an epic. I think just calling it an epic gives it a triumphant tone that overlooks the sadness and the mourning of people lost to enslavement. And I think that tragedy was a better way to do that. And so I compare these sagas, we'll call them, Manuel Zapata Oliveira and Ana Maria Gonçalves in Brazil. And that was my narrative that tied them together. And I show similar phenomena in Dalma Llanos Figueroa in Puerto Rico and in Ney Lopes in Brazil. And those form the basis of other projects that I've had the good luck to be a part of. At the here at Vanderbilt, as Dr. I put together a colloquium that brought together people from France, scholars from France, Brazil, Penn State, UC Irvine, and Vanderbilt, which was our co-sponsor. I worked every day with Graciela. I'm very grateful to her, as well as Juliana Rivas and Denise Joseph, who's our administrative associate in the future Department of World Languages and Literatures. We had 3 keynotes. One was a representative from Palenque, Colombia, along with the top linguists on his language. We had the top scholar in France, Yves Monino, to come out and present, and William Luis, one of my major professors, came out to present on the 50th anniversary of the Cuban biography of a Maroon, or now they just call it Cimarron, which was the true last slave narrative of the Americas, depending on how you define that. It's from 1966, so it's very different from Manzano's text. So I think that this shows the potential of the African diaspora for bringing scholars together to do some really creative work. From that came a special issue of the AfroHispanic Review, where Graciela and I show that escaping slavery is both a historical reality as well as a continuing metaphor for Black resistance and negotiation to this day. Another problem with thinking that that Afro descent comes exclusively from the United Nations is the idea that it's not a local product. And one way that, or practice better said, one way that Latin Americans have shown that this is a local concern is the metaphor of the maroon. There have been maroons since the colonial period. People have wanted freedom. People have been creative since the first time they were in the first enslaved person. People always want to self-govern. So that's our introduction. I got to publish my my essay on Lopes. His novel is about an Afrocentric Brazil. I got to meet my now colleague, Carolina Rodriguez Suruptician, as a scholar through this issue, and she writes on Manzano. Manzano was a house slave, and if you'll hear a narrative that is that's dangerously close to saying that house slaves had it better than field slaves, because field slaves had to work out in the hot sun, and people in the house did not. And her argument is that this is false because people in the house were under surveillance constantly. So there's a different form of violence that people were subject to. Here at the Birmingham Museum of Art, we have a great scholar who works on Africa and Latin America, and she included an essay on African diaspora religions in visual art. A friend of mine, Jacques Ossiei of Gabon, it's a country in Africa, wrote an overview of the imagination of Africa and escape as metaphors for resistance from Latin America. So I was honored to have someone from Africa in the issue. And Bernardino, our keynote speaker from Palenque, Colombia, got to include folktales from Palenque. So I think this would be of particular interest to anyone who wants to know more about Afro-Colombians. But also we have a children's literature course here in our department. And I think that those folk tales that people hear from the age of children all the way up to adults would be a great addition to that course. My book that was based partially on my dissertation is called Challenging the Black Atlantic, the historical novels, the New World novels of Zapata Oliveira and Gonçalves. And I take on this notion of the Black Atlantic. If you see a book about Black people that are not from the United States, it will probably have the term Black Atlantic in the title. It will, in many cases, continue centric because of Paul Gilroy's basis. He is working in England, and he's writing about African American studies, and he shows that African Americans traveled throughout Europe. So even as he is challenging Eurocentric paradigms, he's repeating a different kind of Eurocentrism. He did a great job of moving away from what Afrocentrism meant at the time, which was focused almost exclusively on the African American experience and continued a very essentialist definition of Africa. Manuel Zapata Oliveira was doing that in Colombia 10 years before Gilroy did it, and it took him 20 years to write this novel. So he was working on a paradigm that was far more extensive. It begins before 1619. Enslavement began at least 100 years before the United States in Latin America, and Zapata is depicting that. And so he's showing where most Black people are. Most Black people outside of Africa are in Latin America. Ana Maria Gonçalves is showing the largest country, the largest Black population in the Americas in her novel, and she's doing it from the perspective of an enslaved woman. So these are very important works. Manuel Zapata Oliveira has recently been translated as, his work has been translated as Chango Decolonizing the African Diaspora. When I began this project, it was translated as Chango the Biggest Badass. In Spanish, it's Chango el Gran Putas. People have been dancing around this name for a while. And it's a no-hold-barred challenge to the Eurocentric paradigms of his time. So he starts out in a mythological Africa. It's the Africa of Yoruba Orishas, the spirits. And there's a mythological explanation of how the diaspora, or the Muntu, Muntu means man or humanity, how the Muntu was expelled from Africa and given this mission to bring freedom to themselves and to the Americas. So the next stage in the evolution of the Muntu, this humanity, is the freedom of Black people in Palenque, Colombia, Palenque de San Basilio, that evolves into the Haitian Revolution, the first Black republic in the Americas, that evolves into national independence movements of people who had a vision of including the African diaspora in these new societies. So you've got Morelos in Mexico, you've got the Aleijadinho and Zumbi in Brazil, you've got Bolivar and Padilla in Colombia and Venezuela. And then the Latin American section ends. This is an evolution towards a radically new world. That's what Nuevo Mundo means in an altered Spanish, is a truly new world where we are all free and where we are all represented. The last third of this novel takes place in the United States. It begins in the times of slavery and it ends in the times of Angela Davis in the 1960s. So it's also retelling the history of the United States. Any paradigm that separates Latin America from the United States in describing the history of the diaspora is leaving out something very important. So anyone who reads Manuel Zapata Olivella and attempts to leave the United States out of that discussion needs to account for the last third of his masterpiece. So that's Manuel Zapata Olivella's paradigm. Ana Maria Gonçalves tells the story of a woman who is born on what was then called the Slave Coast, or the Bight of Benin. Now it's in the country of Benin. At the time, it was called Dahomey. And she's enslaved and brought to Brazil. She lives in Salvador, which has been known as Black Rome. It has a very large Afrodescendant population. And she gives birth to a person who is documented in history. His name is Luis Gama, and he was a Black author, or mulatto author, who was a poet, but he was also a lawyer who advocated to free enslaved people in the 19th century. He's about as close as Latin America has to a Frederick Douglass figure. He literally escaped slavery and worked his way up through the police into a law school, and eventually became a lawyer. He's a very inspirational poet and activist. And in many ways, he created his mother's story, but his version of her story was only 7 lines long. So Ana Maria Gonçalves tells things from her perspective over the course of 1,000 pages. Now, she seeks out her son. The mother's name is Kehinde. Kehinde seeks out her son, eventually gives up the quest, and returns to Africa as the one of the historically documented retornados. Right? Retornados are the people who return from slavery to Africa. In many cases, they were returned because they were like these maroons. They're causing a lot of trouble, and they were sent away because they were troublemakers. But many people were given the option to return to Africa, and they took it. And she's an example of one of those people who returned. In her case, it had been just after a slave revolt, and the ships were leaving with all of these troublemakers from the 1835 revolt of the Malês, in which Muslim slaves attempted to take over the capital of Brazil. Could you guys imagine what that history would be like had it been successful? So as you can see, these maps are far more expansive in terms of including Afro-Latin America and the diaspora. They include, unlike Gilroy is in the postmodern discourse. He's debating with modernity and Western Enlightenment ideas as we know them. Zapata is working in the orishas, working in the spirits of Africa. Ana Maria Gonçalves is doing the same. But I'm going to argue with my colleagues who are postmodernists and think that the truth does not matter, that there is no transcendental truth, because that keeps us from dialoguing with historians and from discovering these Black lives of the past. Ana Maria Gonçalves includes a woman's perspective, and it's a feminist text in many ways. But Manuel Zapata Olivella was also, in his own way, attempting to create a feminist text because of the centrality of Angela Davis to his text. Her name is Agni Agni Brown in the novel, but I read his manuscripts at Vanderbilt, and her name was Angela to almost the last moment of sending this off to press. And so she's a very thinly veiled biography of Angela Davis. Double consciousness is central to Paul Gilroy's notion of the African diaspora, because he's saying that there's a Black understanding that is parallel to the Western Enlightenment. Zapata was doing that 10 years before him. You can point to syncretic religions as just one example of a double consciousness that goes beyond the West. And I include LGBTQ issues in this text. If Manuel Zapata Oliveira's goal is freedom for everybody. What about queer characters? He includes queer spirits, but he does not include affirmative LGBTQ identities here on Earth. So there's a problem in that. Ana Maria Gonçalves is writing in 2005 and 2006. So she is much better on including gay characters, trans characters in this huge cast of characters that she creates to recreate the times of enslavement. And lastly, I conclude with two concerns. Paul Gilroy's Black Atlantic, that we continue to use the term in so many books, so many papers, was written in 1993. It's been decades now. So I show how Zapata and Gonçalves are writing about the prison industrial complex and coined by Angela Davis, and about the new Jim Crow, which is very much a part of our present, and the Nuevo Mundo, this vision of evolving towards freedom for all, a new world, a truly new world, is a precursor to what scholars now call Afrofuturism. Afrofuturism basically means a future that includes Black people, and that includes Black people in a way that they are not oppressed in the same ways that we see today. You often see it in science fiction, but it's grown to include a text like Zapata's, which is in many ways historical fiction as well. I've continued this line of thought throughout the decade, and I'm grateful to have the decade to help me promote my second book, which is called Fractal Families in New Millennium Narratives by Afro-Puerto Rican Women. The different countries of Latin America have variants of a term that was coined in Brazil. It's called racial democracy. Racial democracy was coined in the times of Hitler and of Nazis and fascism, where it was very clear that Nazis were racist. And it was in the time of Jim Crow, where it was very clear that Jim Crow laws were racist. And so by contrast, scholars like Gilberto Freire offered up Latin America as being much more democratic. It's not hard to be more democratic than a Nazi. Let's start there. But there's a conservative discourse that says because Latin America is racially mixed, there's no racism here, or it's very light. It's the exception to the rule. That narrative goes all the way back to the 19th century, when there was a counter-abolitionist discourse saying, we don't need to abolish slavery here because it's not as bad as it is in the English colonies. It's not as bad as you've heard from those abolitionists. In Puerto Rico, there's a very specific variant of racial democracy. You'll hear scholars talk about racial democracy in Puerto Rico, but the term you hear more often is the Great Puerto Rican Family. The Great Puerto Rican Family, which implies a harmonious family. There are different variations of it, but it began in the 19th century. And it began amongst the Creole class. These were the slave owners. These were people who had worked their way or inherited their way to the top of the colonial food chain. And now they were considering freedom like the rest of Latin America. Puerto Rico and Cuba were Spain's last colonies. And they created a discourse that said, we are one big family on a big plantation with a good father, the paterfamilias, the good father that is the slave owner, and he takes care of his enslaved people, he takes care of his wife. That has had variants throughout the 20th century, different forms of paternalism, which you might call this, in which the state is taking care of the great family, or the patriarch of any given family is taking care of the the people there on the island, and it's the only group that can keep the gringos, the United States, from destroying our culture. That narrative has successfully elided racial discrimination on the island for decades and over a century. And so a generation of Black female authors are challenging the great Puerto Rican family. And I offer up that they are creating what I call fractal families. I based Fractal on Mayra Santos Febres's idea. She's a novelist. She's probably the most famous living novelist on the island. And she's Afro-Puerto Rican. And she talks about the Caribbean as a fractal. A fractal is a repeating irregular shape. The best example of a fractal in nature is a snowflake. It's a repeating irregular shape. You can see it in coastlines, a repeating irregular shape. And she talks about the Caribbean not as a bunch of separate little islands, separate little nations, but as kind of a network of these fractals, these repeating shapes, these repeating cultural forms, these repeating political forms. And so I take the elements of family in her thought. This was from a series of talks that I was lucky enough to hear because of COVID. They were all broadcast on YouTube. And she radically changes the notion of family and as family allegory to describe Puerto Rico and to describe the Caribbean. And so I'm pointing out family allegories that are much more empowering to Afro-Puerto Ricans, particularly to women, and that are breaking up that harmonious plantation that they were handed as a narrative for the nation. And so she does that in her own cosmopolitan way. One way of breaking out of the plantation is to break outside of the nation itself. So she'll write a novel that is set in Chicago about an Afro-Venezuelan who fall in love and have kinky sex because she likes kinky stuff. And she dresses as a Black woman from Brazil, Chica da Silva, right? And they form a different kind of family. Mayra Santos Febres is also known for her LGBTQ themes and for her interest in performance theory, queer theory, that is very controversial. Performing identities means that your biology doesn't determine necessarily how you're going to perform who you are, right? And so I would say that the fractal families, this new metaphor for the nation and for the Caribbean that she's creating, is much like families of choice, which many LGBTQ people have to form. You can see that in the novel that's partially about Brazil. You can see it in another novel that's about Argentina. It's called the Gardel's Lover, famous tango performer of all time. And it's about his Puerto Rican lover that she imagines and the different networks that they form. Mayra Santos Febres is only one of this new generation of novelists. Yolanda Arroyo Pizarro is going to come and visit us this fall. She was the first woman to marry a woman in Puerto Rico, and she is probably one of the most vocal Black writers on the island. Yvonne Denis Rosario, another gifted writer. She writes short stories, and she includes more male protagonists, but she's part of the same project. She's working on a different notion of the great Puerto Rican family, a fractal family, not only the island, but also the diaspora. Half of Puerto Ricans live in the United States mainland. So she's already including them in her short stories. You've got Dalma Llanos Figueroa in New York, who is revisiting the island and from the plantation to today and altering racist notions of the great Puerto Rican family to create her own fractal family. So in conclusion, I'll look to the future. 2024 is around the corner. And I would like to make the most of the decade while we have it. It's bringing attention not only to my work, but to scholars who work in the diaspora. UAB will be part of that when Yolanda Arroyo Pizarro comes this fall, tentatively scheduled for September when she's going to come. She's going to talk about her own fiction, and she's going to talk about the writing group that she leads, which includes several of the authors that I just mentioned in Puerto Rico. I'm currently working on a bound volume on South Africa and the Lusophone world, the
Hello. Am I the only one who lost Professor Maddox?
No, we all lost
I
him.
am back.
There he is.
John, we lost you toward
Okay.
the first third of your slide there.
Okay, that's fine.
You were talking about Yolanda Arroyo Pizarro's visit to UAB, and you were wrapping up on the conclusion of the decade of people of African descent.
Thank you, John. So, so Yolanda will be with us, and she will talk about her work and the work of Here I am again. So Yolanda will be with us. I am working on a book about the Portuguese-speaking world with colleagues in South Africa and in Brazil. My next projects will be one on, my book projects will be one on Latin America, nonviolence, and Alabama. Try to bring the world to Alabama. It'll work into my course on global Alabama. And my last book project that I have that will come out around 2024 is one on white writers. And I argue that white writers from the Spanish-speaking world are providing a kind of symbolic reparations for slavery because they occupy a different role. It's not the same as Manuel Zapata Oliveira or Ana Maria Gonçalves or these Afro-Puerto Rican writers who are rediscovering their ancestors. My argument is that these white writers are providing a kind of reparations that are symbolic in nature. And lastly, I think that UAB can use the African diaspora, the Jewish diaspora, the indigenous peoples, these different groups and different disciplines to form a center or an interdisciplinary program that is inter-American or transatlantic in nature. So I would like to see the decade result in meaningful change, not only in my work, but also in other scholars' work here at UAB. Thank you so much for your time and your patience and for paying attention to my work. I'm really grateful to you all for being here. If you want to follow up, these are a couple of the book covers here, but thank you so much for being here. I'm really grateful that you came out to hear me speak. I welcome your questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Maddox. Gracias. Obrigado.
Obrigado vocês.
Looks like we have a question in the chat from Josue Diaz. Josue, do you want to ask your question yourself?
Sure, I'd love to. It's actually Stacia Josue's my husband, but I forgot to
Oh,
rename
Stacia.
myself.
My apologies.
That's okay. I had a couple of questions actually. Uh, the first one, you started talking about what the word Black means to you, especially in use as a phenotype, and the implications of that, which I understand your viewpoint. But there seems to be a resurgence of the N-word in very, very popular music. It's never gone away, but it used to be underground music, rap music, music you hear after 10 o'clock. But now some of the more popular music among young people, it's used, I mean, without hesitation. Comedians such as Dave Chappelle throws it out there. And so I'm the person who, I believe that words matter. I believe that when you use the word Black, it matters. I believe there's a reason for, like you were saying, Afrodescendencia, right? That there are implications for that. And I think that the N-word is a reflection of self-hate, to be honest with you, on some level. And I don't think that the word will ever belong to Black people in the sense that we should use it, because it doesn't belong to us. It's a bastardization of the word Negro, which actually could be applied to us in some ways. But so I just wondered what your thoughts on that were.
I don't advocate using the N-word. I don't advocate using the N-word. I do want to caution us against censorship and against anachronistic expectations. I'll give you an example. We'll take a word like Negro that is clearly out of use, and that if I use that with people around me to refer to them, then I would be hurtful, and that's not what I want to do. But the notion of the new Negro movement, that's what the people who lived the Harlem Renaissance called it. Mm-hmm. And so if you look at Alan Locke, he's writing about the new Negro, who are we going to be? And that's a direct influence on Manuel Zapata Olivella, who's born in 1920. So let's put Zapata in context. I don't advocate for censorship. So if a performer says something that is insulting or hurtful, then that person's freedom of speech should be protected, and his critics their freedom of speech should be protected. Chappelle has been boycotted by LGBTQ
Everybody.
people. Yes, because he is a very, very controversial figure. So I believe firmly in the freedom of speech. And I don't think that censorship is a way to make our country better. In the case of Zapata, we're back to the title. The title of his work. Out of consideration, one of the translations that he proposed was Chango, the Holy MFer. Mm-hmm. I mean, this is not something you can get on the shelf at Walmart. No. Right. So, but if you look at his project, if you take the time to read through this, yeah, he'll depict a white racist person calling a Black person by the N-word. But I think that context matters. I think that educating our children matters, and I do not advocate for using hurtful language in any way. And I realize that there's a difficult balance that we have to strike between censorship and decency.
Can I continue that thought?
Sure.
Well, I agree with you. I disagree with censorship. My question is more in, I'll just give you just a moment of background. I lived 10 minutes from where my family were slaves in the 1840s. So And I know what the treatment of them was, and I know what the language used toward them was. And it's the same language that I hear performers using today. But at the time it was used against them, it meant oppression. It meant, you know, being treated like an animal. So when I hear it in use today, I can't help but make the connection between the two. So I'm not sure why it is that Black people in a time where education is possible, progression is possible, opportunities are possible. I just feel like part of the culture insists on taking us all the way back there through their language and making it normal. I feel like they're normalizing things that we should have left decades ago, possibly even centuries ago. So that's why I asked the question.
Manuel Zapata Olivella is a novelist, but he comes out of the avant-garde tradition. So what you're talking about, using this old language, using this old way of thinking about people, one way that he tries to break with that is a term like muntu, which not everybody uses in the United States, not everybody used it in Latin America at the time. He's looking at African languages. He's looking at Africa as a resource and using poetry as a way to create new visions of ourselves. What happens when we put Africa at the center of history and we watch its effect on the Americas? So when you make the word Black and human a synonym, it's a very, very radical way to address the kind of discrimination that you're describing.
Okay, thank you very much. I appreciate that.
Thank you for coming. Thank you for your question.
What other questions are there? John, I wondered if you see any parallels between this idea of Latin American societies as multi-racially democratic. There are these self-conceptions of societies that are inherently not racist because they are so diverse. And in the United States, this idea of color blindness and meritocracy. Do you see any parallels there? And if so, how does that, what are they? What are some distinctions?
Right. So you've got Bonilla is the guy who's written on colorblind racism, among other scholars. And I think that race is a very sensitive topic. People have a hard time talking about it. People have a hard time addressing something that oftentimes makes us feel bad. And if you say that we are all one thing already, not that we have the potential to become more equal or more empowered, but to say that we already are is to say that the victory has already been won, and then there's nothing to do about it, that we are in the best possible world.
Right.
And so in the case of colorblind racism, if we don't consider Black history, if we don't consider Black identity, then if we hear something like, oh, well, this student or this friend of mine, he's having financial troubles in school, facing psychological problems, he lives next to a Superfund site, he's lives in an unhealthy environment, that's just because he made bad choices. And you're going to circle back to blaming victims of racism in that manner. In Latin America, what you will see is that it'll always start out with Blacks and whites in Latin America get along okay, so let's focus on something different. or people are inventing complaints just to get ahead. So if there's any material incentive to assert one's rights, again, I think Black rights in many spaces in Latin America are very, very concrete in nature. Like I don't know of many African American groups that are trying to get land rights based on Black identity, because the history is different. In a place like Palenque, in a place in the Quilombos of Brazil, you've got people that are trying to get land rights. And the reason that they're on that land in the first place is because of enslavement and because of continued discrimination. And so if you are to assert Black identity, people will say that you are making stuff up, that you're complaining, and that you're just doing it with interests in mind, material interest in mind. You're just using it to get these lands that rightfully belong to the military or whoever owns them. You're just trying to get that spot in college that you don't deserve. I'm thinking right now of Jair Bolsonaro, who is the current president of Brazil, that says that affirmative action programs in college are just filling colleges with unqualified Black people. That's the kind of statement that you can make if your belief is that we're all already equal and you're not willing to look at the repercussions of this history.
Yeah, they don't call him the Trump of the tropics for nothing. Thank you for that. It seems like, and how do you see this fitting in with the current movement or reactivity to the banning of critical race theory in schools in Florida, movement 2 bills in the Alabama House? I mean, it's happening. Is this also because people are abdicating their responsibility, their role to engage with topics that may be upsetting? What's going on there?
The Heritage Foundation earned their money when they came up with this strategy. I respect Republicans because they play a mean game of chess. They are very good strategists. And so we have to admit that this is something that might get people elected. It probably will get people elected because it touches the heartstrings. And so I have conservative friends, and they keep me informed on what their discourse is. So you'll see something going by like they'll show 2 children, one's white, one's Japanese, Asian, reportedly Japanese, is saying that holding this white child accountable for slavery is like holding this this Japanese child accountable for Pearl Harbor. This is completely devoid of any context. And it's based on the notion that teachers who talk about Black people and who talk about Black culture, history, and literature, that they are bullied little white kids to feel bad. And that speaks to some people because when there's an issue that is right in front of your face, it's much more difficult to address something that's big picture. So if you're a student and you feel bad when the teacher says that much of the privilege that you have, that's financial, symbolic, etc., comes from the fact that people who looked like you, and in many cases your own ancestors, enslaved other people, then you're naturally going to feel bad. And if you're making decisions, if you're speaking based only on feelings, if you're voting based only on feelings, then you're going to abdicate that responsibility, that historical responsibility. Judith Butler and Karl Marx both talk about the weight of history. You're not even noticing what's on your back, right? Because all you can see is that thing that upset you before your eyes. And so I don't think that people are intentionally abdicating their debt to history and the need to understand and respect Black people. I think that they're being distracted by a very emotional approach to politics. And I think that students will do well to challenge those narratives that are coming out that are based on a feeling of white victimization.
Thank you. Do we have a final question for Dr. Maddox? Well, if you would, please join me in thanking him once again. We really appreciate your thoughtful remarks and wonderful presentation, Dr. Maddox.
Thank you all so much for being here. Muito obrigado, muchas gracias.
Gracias.